In September of 2024, a wave of mysterious Pokémon prototype and playtest cards surfaced, thousands of them supposedly from the personal collection of Takumi Akaban, a Japanese game designer credited as one of the trio that created the Pokémon TCG. To collectors, these cards seemed to hold tremendous historical value, but they looked unlike anything anyone had ever seen before. Story began with the proof of concept Seadra, the very first Pokémon card ever made. It used a Game Boy style frame and displayed only the most basic bits of data. The back was not a prototype design at all, but simply a copy of the Pokémon Red and Green Game Boy cover art. Next came the alpha prototypes, a set of just 26 cards printed on thick cardstock using Game Boy sprites. From there, the designs became more elaborate. The alpha playtest cards introduced full colour backgrounds and trainer cards, with gameplay mechanics that looked far closer to the base set we know today. The beta playtest expanded to all 151 Pokémon. The later Delta playtest cards came even closer to the finished product, with designs almost identical to official base set cards, including a Charizard drawn by Mitsuhiro Arita. Since these cards have very little information, many grading companies refuse to authenticate them. That is until CGC stepped up and said this:
"We were able to work very closely with Takumi Akaban, one of the original developers of the Pokémon TCG, to verify the card's authenticity and history."
Not long after, public auction houses like Sotheby's started to list them for very large numbers, popularising the market for these cards and giving the impression that they were legitimate pieces of history. With that seal of approval, the legend spread quickly. These were no longer just strange cards, they were now spoken of as lost history. The market reacted instantly. Collectors and investors swarmed wherever these cards would go. At Sotheby's, they were in its Holy Grails sale, a feat accomplished by only a few cards in the world. A Pikachu Alpha prototype sold for more than $200,000. This was one of the highest prices ever paid for a modern Pokemon item, outpacing even some trophy cards. Other sales regularly hit 5 figures, with certain playtest cards selling for between $5,000 and $15,000. What had begun as unusual curiosities were now commanding the kinds of prices reserved for the most iconic cards in the hobby. Collectors on forums and social media posted photos of their slabs, fueling more interest. Every new auction result was dissected, and population reports showed dozens, then hundreds, of these cards entering the market. Within weeks, they were no longer treated as obscure experiments. They were being spoken of as the missing link in the history of the Pokémon TCG, relics that captured the earliest steps of the game's design. But not everyone was convinced. As the prices climbed and the supply of prototypes seemed endless, experienced collectors began to raise questions. If these cards truly came from the 1990s, why had none of them surfaced in nearly 3 decades of Pokémon collecting? And why were there suddenly thousands of them appearing all at once? Who submitted these cards? If they are authentic and a big deal, wouldn't the person responsible be more than happy to take credit for it? All of these doubts would soon give rise to the first serious investigation. Skepticism first arose over the condition of the cards. Many received pristine 10s from CGC, even though true playtest cards should have been shuffled, marked and worn during development. Surviving in flawless shape after nearly 3 decades seemed implausible. Collectors also questioned the sheer number appearing on the market. Sets of 10 or 12 surfaced at once, across multiple categories, despite only a handful of people being involved in the TCG's creation. For something so historically limited, the volume felt far too high. Then came concerns about the way the cards were actually built. CGC described them as paper mounted on cardstock, which raised more questions than it answered. In theory, that could describe a real prototype process, where printed paper sheets were glued to thicker stock for playtesting. But the problem was timing. If that mounting was done recently, not in the 1990s, it would explain 2 suspicious patterns at once: why so many cards suddenly appeared, and why they were in such flawless condition. Modern mounting could produce a wave of fresh, clean examples that looked nothing like the heavily handled, worn-out test pieces collectors expected to see from the early days. These doubts spread quickly, and soon one collector would look closer, finding evidence no one could ignore. The mystery around the playtest cards might have stretched on for years, if not for a single collector known as PFM. On forums, PFM was already respected for his technical approach to card collecting. Where most people stopped at surface impressions, he went further, studying cards under microscopes, scanning them at ultra-high resolution, and digging into the smallest production details. When he obtained a few of the supposed prototypes himself, he chose not to take their authenticity for granted. What he discovered changed everything. Under magnification, the cards revealed a pattern of faint yellow dots scattered across the surface. These were not blemishes or dust, they were part of a system called machine identification codes, microscopic printer tracking dots embedded by modern colour laser printers. Most home and office printers add these dots automatically. They form a repeating grid pattern, typically invisible to the naked eye but clear when magnified or when colour channels are adjusted. Each brand uses a different layout, but many encode the date, time and serial number of the printer. Law enforcement has used them for decades as forensic evidence in cases of forged documents and counterfeit currency. The thing to note from this is that the dots are printed on by the kind of printers you and I would buy. Things like magazines, posters, and real Pokémon cards will not have dots. They are printed by large industrial offset printers. PFM documented the process carefully by photographing the cards at high resolution and aligning the grids against known decoding charts. He was able to read the hidden metadata. One common pattern, called the Xerox DocuColor code, repeats in a 15x8 checkerboard grid across the sheet. Each column represents binary values. The 8th column encodes the year, for instance. On one Nidoqueen card, the dots decoded to June 29, 2024. Other cards revealed similar dates throughout 2024. None pointed to the mid-1990s. The implications were devastating. MICS did not exist when the Pokémon TCG was being developed. If a card carried these yellow dots, it could not have been printed in 1996. Instead, the evidence tied the cards directly to modern printers, the kind you or I could buy today. PFM shared his results step by step. Images of dot grids, decoding instructions, timestamps, and examples. Other collectors repeated the process on their own cards and confirmed identical results. It was no longer one person's claim versus another's. The dots were there for anyone to see. For the collecting world, this was the turning point. The mystery was now a scandal, and the truth was literally printed into the cards themselves. Once the dots were decoded, there was no going back. PFM's discovery of yellow printer dots didn't stay isolated. This evidence was repeatable and consistent across different examples. What had been presented as 1990s prototypes were in fact modern prints. The fallout was immediate. Cards that had sold for thousands, and in some cases hundreds of thousands, through auction houses collapsed in value. Attention turned to CGC, the grading company that had authenticated hundreds of these cards. Their earlier article highlighting a collaboration with Takumi Akabane and presenting him as a key figure in verifying the cards was quietly removed from their website. In its place, CGC published a new notice acknowledging the controversy. That notice contained the most decisive action yet, a recall list. CGC identified 1,954 certification numbers tied to playtest, prototype, and presentation cards, and asked that all holders return them. Each card listed was subject to review and decertification. Refunds, however, proved far more complicated. CGC has confirmed that they are compensating collectors who return affected cards, but the process has not been uniform. Some holders reported receiving full refunds that matched their purchase prices, while others only secured partial compensation. In many cases, auction houses or private sellers, rather than CGC itself, were left to handle reimbursements. Collectors described long wait times and uneven communication, with some disputes still unresolved months after the recall notice. For those who had spent life-changing sums on what they believed to be historical prototypes, few felt truly made whole. This recall was the final confirmation. What began as a wave of excitement in September 2024 ended less than a year later with a retraction, a vanished article, and an inconsistent patchwork of refunds. The playtest card saga closed not with discovery, but with correction. A legend once thought to be lost history is now remembered as one of the most high-profile recalls in the history of the Pokémon TCG.